It's a great pleasure to greet you again this morning. And we are meeting here under the auspices of what is called the Frenkel-Zuckerman Institute for Global Economics. And before we go to the proceedings themselves, let me just recognize for 1 minute Mr. Eric Gertler, who is the godfather of this institute. The institute is being hosted in the Kohler School of Management, and we have with us the Dean, Mr. Moshe Tzviran. And we also have with us Professor Leo Lederman, who is going to be the executive director of our activities. Now with this prelude, we move to this symposium that over the years has become one of the hallmarks of our annual meetings. And this time, and in general, the reason why a symposium is successful is not because of the conductor, but because of the musicians themselves. And we have here a dream cast of characters. You know, we are just few weeks after the Passover holiday, and during the Passover Seder, the first evening of the holiday, as you know, there is a segment where we say, Dayenu, Dayenu. If God only did this to us, it would have been fine, but he did more, and if he did only this, it would have been fine, it would be more. So for this meeting today, if we had Janet Yellen alone, it would be fine. And if we had Ngozi, Okonjo-Iweala, it would be fine. And if we had Axel Weber, it would be fine. But we have all of them. And as in the prayer we say, God is so good to us. So with this prelude, let me just, one last remark of protocol, and it's pleasure, like always, to have with us the president of the university, Professor Joseph Klafter. We have with us the chairman of the executive council, Mr. Eli Gelman. And we have with us also former participants, some of the former participants in this event, and they include an honorary doctor from last year, Governor Karnit Flug. And yes, indeed, in a previous incarnation, Professor Lederman was also part of this panel. So, enough said, because all of this is to say that we have both continuity and change. Some of the questions that will be discussed today are the same as they have been discussed before, and not because we forgot the answers, but because the answers differ. And the answers differ not because they got more wisdom to give us the answers, but the world has changed. And as Keynes once said, when circumstances change, I change my mind. What about you? This was the argument that was made. But I want you also to know, don't change your mind with any fake change of circumstances, because John Robinson, his student at the time, told him, yes, master, but before changing my mind, I check the facts and I check whether the implications deserve changing of mind. So with this philosophical approach, and I say philosophical because our first speaker, Janet Yellen, started her life in studying philosophy. I don't know what went in your mind to decide. This was a reminder like in the opera, please turn off your phones. I don't know what went through your mind when you decided to switch from your planned study of philosophy to economics, definitely because it is called the dismal science, as we know, but you did it. Janet Yellen, I will start with few introductions for each one of them in turn, but Janet Yellen was described in so many publications as the most powerful woman economist in the world, the most prominent woman that reached that pinnacle, the person that proves that glass ceilings are made of very soft glass if you have a hard brain, and the person that really has made it. She has made it not for herself only, but she is credited as bringing the world into much greater stability than what it was when she took office. She's very generous, and yesterday in her speech, she spoke all the time about really the credit goes to her predecessor, because she has the culture of academia, which says we are standing on the shoulders of our predecessors. And that's why we always speak about not only about President Klafter, but also about Chabash Ben Shachar and previous presidents. But the reality is, if it was not for you at the same place at the right time, we would not have been here today where we are. And in fact, you would have been here under any title of your journey through your life. You were an academic, of course, Harvard, Yale, then Berkeley. You were chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors of President Clinton. You were vice chairman of the Federal Reserve under President Obama. You were chairperson of the Federal Reserve of President Obama. You were chairman for a short while under President Trump. You were the first democratic appointee and chairperson of the Fed since Paul Volcker, and there were many in between. So the fact is that you can tell a lot of stories. So rather than me pulling it, and Janet is a pro. And pro means, you told me that I have 7 to 10 minutes for opening remarks. She did not know what we are going to ask her. So do your 7 to 10 minutes. But I can tell you that after this, we will ask you some questions, including what did you say on the phone call that came on this date or that. But in any event, you are welcome to speak from here or from there, whatever. I think you prefer to sit? Okay. Okay, I don't want to say what I was told by somebody, by our friend Michael Musa. If you want to be heard, speak up. If you want to be seen, stand up. He went on to say, if you want to be respected, shut up. But we want you, please, I think.
Okay, I'll stand.
Please.
Jacob, thank you. I got my marching orders, I'll stand. And I'm going to start off, if I may, with some comments on the U.S. economy, and happy to return to more personal issues and anecdotes later on. So let me open up with some comments on U.S. economic performance. In terms of key macroeconomic objectives, the United States is performing exceptionally well. The financial crisis had a devastating impact on American workers, and the recovery was prolonged and difficult, but I think it's finally complete. The job market is now very strong. At 3.6%, the U.S. unemployment rate is at a 50-year low, and even after 9 years of expansion, job gains still average around 200,000 per month. An unexpected and favorable development is that prime-age labor force participation has moved up considerably. It had been on a downward trend for quite a long time, likely reflecting a secular loss of middle-income jobs and depressed wages for less educated workers. While some recovery was expected after the financial crisis, labor force participation has moved up far more than had been anticipated. And in recent years, with very tight labor markets, the strongest wage gains have gone to less skilled workers, those with high school education or less, and to minorities. And that's a very welcome development after decades of stagnant wages for these workers and rising income inequality. The strong job market is inducing firms to spend more on training and to hire individuals that earlier in the expansion would not have met the qualifications bar, such as those with criminal records. These developments are very positive, although they have by no means fully alleviated the distress that many Americans feel who rightly experience little gains in recent decades. Economists often draw parallels between today's strong labor market and that of the late 1960s. Unemployment has declined to levels last seen in 1969. But in contrast to that era, inflation is running at very low levels, if anything, too low. By 1969, in contrast, inflation had picked up to 6%. And when OPEC a few years later tripled the price of oil, inflation became enemy number one in the United States, the top macroeconomic problem facing the nation for several decades. Today, inflation is running at only 1.5%. While deviations of inflation above and below a central bank's inflation target are normal and to be expected, in the United States, inflation has been running below 2%, only briefly reaching 2% for the last 7 years, and that is a concern. Many people these days say that the old empirical relationship explaining inflation, called the Phillips curve, is simply dead. I tend to disagree. I see labor market slack, inflation expectations, and supply shocks as the key influence. Labor market slack matters, but the relationship is weak and other things have dominated. In the years immediately after the crisis, inflation was held down by high unemployment. In subsequent years, as the drag from a weak labor market faded and now is operating to push inflation up a bit, supply shocks of various types have been holding it down. Importantly, there were substantial reductions in oil prices, and also beginning in mid-2014, a large appreciation in the dollar, which held down import prices. Last year, none of those factors were important, and the Fed anticipated that inflation would come in right near its target of 2%, and indeed it did run at 2% as expected for most of the year. But in recent months, for reasons that are not entirely clear, it slipped again. Arguably, the recent decline is due to transitory factors, and when they die out, inflation will move back to 2%. But chronic inflation below the Fed's inflation target is a real concern because it creates the potential for inflation expectations, which have been remarkably well anchored near 2% since the mid to late 1980s. It allows them to slip over time. And indeed, there is already some evidence suggesting that that may have happened. Since inflation expectations are an important determinant of actual inflation, a slip in inflation expectations would likely drag inflation down yet further. And this is a particular problem in the low interest rate environment that the US and most other developed countries are now in, since that entails relatively little scope for central banks to respond by cutting rates. Moreover, lower inflation tends to further lower the average level of nominal interest rates, and especially in a low interest rate environment, the so-called zero lower bound on short-term interest rates will often constrain monetary policy. Let me finally turn to the pace of economic growth. Last year, growth came in at 3%, but it looks to be moderating this year to a lower pace, around 2%. This was to be expected, and in my view, it's desirable because that's close to the sustainable pace of growth in the United States, a pace that's determined by labor force growth and productivity growth, and is consistent with a stable degree of labor market slack. The U.S. labor force is growing about 0.5% per year, and productivity growth, which averaged only a very low 1% over the past decade, is expected to pick up to something closer to 1.5%, resulting in potential output growth around 2%. With the labor market already very tight, it's appropriate, in my view, for growth to moderate to trend. Faster growth creates some significant upside inflation risks. Several factors are responsible for the anticipated slowdown. Last year, demand was boosted by a very expansionary fiscal policy and tax cut, solid global growth, and for most of the year, quite accommodative financial conditions. Although the Fed had been boosting interest rates toward a more normal or neutral level since 2015, overall financial conditions tightened very little until late in the year, mainly due to a surging stock market. The stock market swooned at year-end, but subsequently has mainly recovered. So financial conditions are now modestly, but not excessively, tighter than last year. In addition, global growth has slowed and there is less fiscal stimulus. Given the strong recovery of the economy, the Fed has taken its foot off the monetary accelerator and shifted policy into roughly neutral gear. The overnight interest rate now stands at 2.4%, very close to estimates of the neutral rate that neither propels faster growth nor retards it. With the economy growing at a solid, albeit diminished pace, and the labor market tight and inflation quite low, the Fed has made clear that they are on hold for the time being, and that going forward, a data-dependent approach in which the next change in short rates could be in either direction. I consider this stance of policy appropriate. Of course, though, there are risks to the outlook, and the most recent one on the horizon stems from the escalation of trade tensions between the United States and China, which I fear could, if not resolved, slow global growth and U.S. growth. So it's appropriate that the direction and timing of future interest rate moves depends on incoming data that bear on the outlook. Let me conclude with a mention of two longer-run issues facing the Fed. The first pertains to its monetary policy framework and strategy. With interest rates expected to remain low, the Fed will have, as I mentioned, all too little ammunition to address the next downturn. It's currently considering whether a change in its framework could bolster its future firepower. Another issue facing the Fed concerns its independence. Like most other central banks, the Fed has been structured by Congress to be able to make monetary policy decisions free of political considerations. And I can personally attest that politics have never been present at the FOMC table. Research clearly supports the conclusion that independent central banks improve macroeconomic performance. However, President Trump has been highly critical of Fed policy in recent months and has threatened to appoint individuals to the board who would be driven by a political agenda. The threats at this stage to Fed independence are not severe, in my view, but could become more severe over time, and especially if these attacks undermine public support for the Fed. Thanks. Let me stop.
Thank you, Janet. And obviously, I think that you left no cloud about what you actually said and what you actually think. And that's an important change of style during the period of Janet's service on the Fed, great changes in the degree of transparency have taken place. And when the Fed chair speaks, he is understood. Some of you are old enough to remember the period that Alan Greenspan was the chairperson of the Fed, and with whom it was very difficult to know what he spoke, but nobody understood what he really meant. And it became a strategy. And there is a true story. You know, he dated his wife for many, many years. His wife is Andrea Mitchell. And one time after they got married, he was asked, why did you have to wait so long? She's such a prominent anchorwoman in the US. And he says, I did not wait. I offered and proposed many times, but I was not understood. He had a regular testimony in Congress, something that I'm sure Janet is not missing. Those meetings in the Senate or the Congress. And one time he gave a testimony and the congressman told him, Mr. Greenspan, you were so clear today. And he said, in such a case, I must have failed. We crossed the Atlantic. We did arrange with us here that we will stay in the industrial countries first. So that's why Axel Weber is the next in line, and then we will go to the real part of the world where the future is. But let me come back for a minute to Axel Weber. Like many of the prominent central bankers today, professionalism is the name of the game. And while he is the chairman of UBS, he is here and he's in his current position because of the credibility and the professionalism that he has demonstrated during a long career as an academic and as a policymaker. He was the president of obviously the most important and the most respected central bank in Europe, the German Deutsche Bundesbank, which he led in great force and success. In that capacity, he was also on the managing board of the European Central Bank during a period that we will come back in the Q&A of the great crisis, and a lot of holy cows had to be slaughtered, and a lot of preconceptions had to be changed, and central banking has changed since. He has come to these positions after a nice academic career, very distinguished in Germany. I still remember him in the Constance era during the 70s. And moving on to London, after the term ended, he moved to the University of Chicago, went to Cologne. I do zigzag with the various decades of his career. But the most important one, today, you cannot think of a single body that deals with central banking that Axel Weber is not playing a very prominent role. Clearly, the most distinguished European in that forum. In fact, you are the third prominent member of the European Central Bank here. We have had Jean-Claude Trichet, who is an honorary doctor. We have had Mario Draghi, who is an honorary doctor. And now we have you, who is a George Wise medalist. And with this, in this context, you see what is the rate of return on good performance. You come to Tel Aviv University and you join the crowd. Andy Cohen, there is a seat here for you. Please come in. You cannot stand. No, it's a fire hazard. Andy Cohen. The reason why I say it is that he has the tendency of coming in and leaving after 5 minutes. You asked for it. Okay. Axel Weber, please come tell us about where Europe goes, what do you think about it, and I will come back to you with a Q&A.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure being here again for number of years I've been coming to the country. At the moment, I come in my role as chairman of UBS, an insignificantly small Swiss bank, with a global client base. I want to make 2 points today because Janet started with the US economy and outlook and some discussions around the Federal Reserve System. I would start with the European outlook and with some risk around that outlook. And my second point is beyond the outlook and the risks is the uncertainty, which is distinctly different from the risks in the sense that we are in a time where some scholarly reports, indices that are gathered suggest that the index of economic uncertainty is at the second highest it has ever been since the data has been collected, and that's been roughly 20 years. And that tells you something about how big the influence of politics now is on the market outlook. And since politics very often is a zero-one variable and hard to put your head around as a market participant, it basically increases uncertainty. And we all know in economics, if there is uncertainty, it delays actions, it postpones investments, and it's an uncertainty that is actually negative for economic activity and can be quite profoundly negative if that uncertainty is at an all-time high. So concerning the economic outlook, in particular for Europe, the strong first quarter of 0.4 GDP growth in Europe should not be taken at face value to continue. We expect that there is no acceleration ahead. Inflation jumped back to 1.7%, but instead of acceleration to better growth rates, we believe the European economy will stay below potential growth, around 1.3% this year and next year, and is going to underperform. Some of the weakness was driven out of industrial production, in particular in Germany. There were some transitory factors in that, so I'm not that concerned about sort of Germany coming back to average growth, which means a slight improvement in Germany, but the Eurozone as a whole is probably going to move sideways with 1.3% below potential growth. So no closing of output gaps, and the number of jobs that will be created will be quite lagging the number of growth in jobs that Janet reported. So a very different trajectory for the European economy in a late cycle development. And also we expect inflation to remain subdued, to actually decline in the coming months. A lot of what happened in Europe was headline driven, and we don't expect that to persist. In the upcoming June meeting, we expect the ECB to focus largely on the technical details of what is called targeted long-term refinancing operations. I remember when we introduced those, they weren't part of our operating procedure. We usually did very short-term operations. We extended them to 1 year. We extended them to 2 years. It has been extended to 4 years by now. And rather than being general at fixed rate, and the fixed rate for these tenders at the moment is 0, so banks can get money from the ECB for free if they have a use for it, and they can actually, with the targeted LTROs, keep that money for 4 years, which in terms of credit already gives banks a lot of leeway to provide credit to the economy. But the European credit market is still clogged. It's still not working the way it should be. And unlike in the US, where the ECB cannot look at a capital market, which is deep and liquid, Europe, 70% of investment is done through bank credit. And if the banks are focusing on strengthening their balance sheet rather than providing credit to the economy, whatever you do around the supply side of credit and the financing conditions around credit will not translate one-to-one into financing the economy. So I do see the discussion, if and when we come to the next round of easing, to really go from where the current framework is to looking at other measures beyond the current framework, again, on bringing money into the economy, not just through the banking channel, maybe in terms of helping establish the credit channels. But when we moved to these long-term operations, they were simply a European reflection of what was done on the other side of the Atlantic in the Fed, and namely, do pretty much your operating framework, but become very bold in terms of time horizons and in terms of conditions for that. We expect the ECB to not discuss interest rates anytime short. Actually, I think they will, after making clear what the new LTROs are. And one reason, let me just say, why these long-term targeted operations need to be reviewed is they automatically run out 4 years. So unlike in other operations like the balance sheet operations where the central bank buys assets and grows its balance sheet, these are self-unwinding. And unless they are renewed, they would unwind. So not doing anything at the moment would be a restrictive monetary policy move, and the ECB needs to prevent some of these running out, so they need to be prolonged, and the terms and conditions need to be discussed. The second point, the ECB also has moved to forward guidance, tying their hands for some time horizon. They used to talk about interest rates staying where they are until mid-19. They prolonged that to end of 19. We probably will see the ECB firmly on hold over the summer, but by September, they probably will renew that forward guidance. I would not be surprised if mid-20 or even end of 20 were part of the new guidance, but that is only another step in a series of steps. I think that most of the central banks are actually at the end of their tightening cycle by now. We are in the late cycle development, and I expect monetary policy to normalize in the next cycle. Actually, I've been talking about normalization being a feature of the next cycle for some time. On the European side, I actually think even the start of any normalization will not be a feature of this cycle, but of the next cycle. So a very firmly predictable central bank where the odds of a next move being an expansionary move and interest rates slightly declining in a corrective fashion rather than interest rates continuing to normalize, in my view, is the most likely outcome. And so, going back to what we very often discuss when I meet clients, when I talk in my current profession about how to invest against such a background, that has become a very difficult task. Because your usual universe of riskless return, fixed income asset, has become returnless risk. And that is very difficult then to not have a benchmark in your portfolios that offers you a return. So we talk very often about a world that is characterized by 4 letters, TINA, there is no alternative to equity. And that's why many of the investors are focused on the equity universe. There was a short while where there was a real alternative, and that was last year when 10-year Fed funds rate was above the inflation rate. There was a short glimpse of a real return in fixed income assets, and the only country that provided it was the United States. But that outlook has disappeared, and so has the difficulty, so has the ease of having a fixed rate, real return in portfolios. Where do we go from here? I think it is fair to say that central banks, basically when you look at what they will do next, will face a number of issues. The first one is, as I said before, much of the European framework of central bank policy has largely been copying what the Fed does. It was tried, it was tested, it worked, and Europeans have embarked on it. The problem I sometimes see with European monetary policy frameworks is they insufficiently take into account a different capital market that provides huge alternatives for corporates, for financing, and that Europe needs its own version of how to enable financing of the economy if the banks are not playing the usual part of transmission. And I think as long as the banking system is in Europe where it is, and I can tell you, US banks are in a much different place to European banks in terms of profitability. The US has fixed its banking system faster. The capital market has helped the healing of US banks in a faster way. So US banks are quite distinctly different in terms of profitability to European banks. Switzerland is a country that has a reasonably sized capital market compared to Europe. For example, Zurich in a global capital market index is among the top 10. There is no other European country except the United Kingdom, with London, which is the capital market number 2 globally, that has a top 10 capital market. And that has implications for monetary policy. And I think in the next round of easing, more targeted policies directly aimed at providing corporate financing, not necessarily through banks, will be part of what needs to be done. Banks will look at broader set of collaterals. They would look at broader set of counterparties in their frameworks. But of course, you then have to also move away from the current framework of basically doing repo, because that is only a channel that is eligible to banks. And you'll see quite a lot of academic discussions in the next few years about how the framework can be extended against the background that if and when we come to the need for more easing, how can we do that that we've really not moved away from the zero lower bound and have balance sheets that are a multiple of what they used to be before the crisis. And there's going to be a discussion of more of the same, may not be enough to deal with another downturn. But it's an interesting debate to contribute to. And I always discovered that, having been a former central banker, you take huge interest in that discussion, not just because it's interesting per se, it's also interesting for banks, it's interesting for the clients we serve, and therefore it's an important part to look at. Let me mention one other thing. We talked about US presidency and the different style of the US president in engaging with central banks. You see very similar developments on the European side of things. And we've had that, actually, as Janet said, we've had that on and off, all of us in our political careers as central bankers, but there were basically calls from the sidelines of central banks do this, do the other, and that's been the normal noise of a democratic society where transparency and accountability is important and where central banks basically face that accountability by, as Janet was doing, reporting to the Senate, reporting to the Parliament about the decisions taken, but not going there to get guidance or feedback. And what we're seeing in Europe is exactly the same as we see in the US. It is coming up, and I'm quite concerned that anything that is seen as happening on the other side of the Atlantic, with a complete change in the European Parliament that is ahead of European Parliament election, the mood and the tone in the European Parliament and by European policymakers who are more likely to be more nationalist than they were in the last European Parliament, will also change the mood music in the European Parliament when the President of the European Central Bank goes there and reports. And it's very important to understand that in Europe, there are only two instruments that are at the European level. One is monetary policy, and the other one is competition policy. I'm already quite concerned that competition policy gets criticized because it's the one European tool for a single market you need, a level playing field competition, and that gets criticized if industrial policy from a national perspective is not seen as being supported by the European Commission authority. I'm quite concerned that with more nationalist parliaments, a European monetary policy, which is a single monetary policy for an entity that is less well defined than the United States, namely an association of European countries with no common fiscal policy, with no common monetary, or with no common policies outside monetary policy, that the mood and the pushback against the single currency in the European Parliament will get stronger. We have to be very aware of that, and those of us who believe in the euro, who believe that the European project is very good, should do everything we can to support the European institutions, and first and foremost the European Central Bank, in its endeavor to make the euro work and to make Europe a more integrated entity, because fragmentation for Europe is a disaster. We've seen this time and again. Only a united Europe will stand strong. And so my plea is, let's be very cautious with how central banks can do their job in a new environment. And I will watch this very closely. And I think those that are in favor of Europe should speak up if there is too much pushback against a single monetary policy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Axel. We are, excuse me for telling you, but we are moving from the old world to the new world now. The fact of the matter is that if in 1990, for example, you wanted to know where the world goes, it was enough to know where the US, Germany, and Japan go. They produced, Europe and the US and Japan produced about 2/3 of world output. Today, they produce just 1/3 of world output. Where did it go? It went to the emerging markets, primarily in Asia, but in general for the emerging markets. The emerging markets have a lot of things that are unique to them, whereas Europe is aging and shrinking in terms of population. Demography is important. Africa is the youngest continent in the world, and if they deal with the things that they need to, they will become also the most prominent. If there is one spokesman that is the most eloquent one for the emerging markets and for Africa, it is our distinguished guest, Ngozi. It's difficult to pronounce her last name, so let's pretend that we are so friendly, so it's Ngozi. And I'm really delighted that you are here together with your husband today, and we were all privileged last night to bestow upon you the very distinguished honorary doctorate. Some people describe Ngozi as the turbo, the dynamism, the passion, the conviction, the perseverance, you name it. But when she takes the floor to speak for Africa, you must listen, because she makes sense. She comes with a very strong academic credential, Harvard, MIT. She was first Minister of Finance in the early part of this millennium. Then she took a break. She actually became the foreign minister at some stage. Then they said to her, come back to be the Minister of Finance. There is still the question, why do people ask a former minister to come back? Either because she did so well or because they are generous and say, we will give you another chance. But the fact is that in between, she became the managing director of the World Bank. Obviously, the most prominent person happens to be also the most prominent woman. And we see here, and it's very important in this university that we all understand that this business of a ceiling glass is not an issue that constrains everyone, which means we need to ask ourselves, how do we avoid, eliminate, take care of it so there is no ceiling glass? And those two ladies are good representatives of what needed to be done. In her spare time, Ngozi also deals with critical issues that are improving social welfare. She's joining and chairing various initiatives to the empowerment of women, to the empowerment of youth, to deal with vaccination and immunization, to deal with alleviation of poverty, and all the other things. And when you talk in Africa and you ask investors, what keeps you out? Many will tell you, poor governance. So she saw it as the hallmark of her administration to remove corruption, to fix the governance. There is some way to go, but she opened that gate. So it is in this regard, let me invite you to make few remarks and then we'll ask you other questions. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob. As I was sitting there listening to Janet and Axel, I thought maybe I should just keep quiet so I can get some respect. It's better. So I have nothing to say. But, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in this wonderful campus. Lives up to everything I was told. And to have a chance to be with Jacob again is fantastic. And thank you for the honor last night. Very exciting for me and my family. Well, you've listened to two eminent macroeconomists and monetary policy experts, two central bankers. So I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. Of course, talk a bit about emerging markets, but particularly also shift to what I would call maybe real-world economic development problems that are being faced in emerging markets, but particularly, especially in Africa. I'll concentrate on that because I think you'll not get a chance for a long time, perhaps, to listen to someone else talking about issues on Africa. So Janet has spoken of strong growth in the US with risks to the global outlook. And Axel has talked of below potential growth in Europe. Well, the global economy itself has been strong overall for the past 2 years, but it's also begun to lose momentum since late last year, due largely to the heightened geopolitical risks, the trade tensions, and the policy uncertainty in many countries, all of which are affecting consumer and business sentiment and causing trade and overall economic activity to slow. Following strong growth in 2017 and early 2018 of around 3.25%, global growth, 3.75%, sorry, global growth is slowing to an estimated 3.25% this year, according to the IMF. And the slowdown is concentrated in the advanced countries and to a lesser extent in China. But assuming the risks mentioned earlier subside, we expect global economic growth to rise back up to 3.5% next year and settle around this rate over the next 5 years, according to the IMF. But the point I want to make is that the aggregate growth outlook masks a sharp difference between advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies, as Jacob mentioned. Growth in emerging market and developing economies will average close to 5%, about 3 times faster than the 1.5% rate for advanced economies. Moreover, the share of emerging market and developing economies in global economic output has continued to rise from 50% in 2007 to now about 60%, as you indicated, production of all goods and services. And because of the higher share of output and faster rate of economic expansion, emerging markets and developing economies will account for about 4/5 of the increase in global economic activity over the next 5 years. This continuing rise in the share of emerging markets and developing economies stokes some tensions, such as what you see between Western countries and China. It also begs the question of the extent to which the present global governance structure reflects reality. The developed countries are holding fast to governance structures in the multilateral system that no longer reflect global economic realities. And I predict that this situation is unsustainable and will continue to stoke tensions. Maybe a topic we return to. On the back of all this, the current geopolitical environment is worrisome because the world is grappling with economic and societal challenges that we've not encountered before, which put us in uncharted territory and generates understandably a lot of anxiety. These challenges include demographic changes that have been talked about, inequality, climate change, the disruptive effects of technology, of course, the trade tensions and in circular stagnation, among others. Most of these challenges are global in nature, and some, like climate change, require us to act with urgency and scale. All cannot be addressed without collaboration and coordinated global policy actions. Unfortunately, the challenges come at a time when our ability to cooperate appears considerably diminished due to the rise of populism and a reversion to protectionism and unilateralism in several countries. Clearly, the increased globalization of markets has brought some challenges to national governments in their attempts to manage their economies and societies. But the appropriate response, in my view, is not inward-looking protectionism, but rather a determination of how we can maximize the benefits of globalization whilst acting forcefully to minimize its costs through greater attention to those who are excluded and stronger, more balanced global institutions and rules. But in the interest of time, let me just focus on maybe on 3 points out of the list that I mentioned. I'd like to say something about inequality, technology, and demographic trends, and how I see them affecting the world, particularly Africa and developing countries. First, I think the issue of inequality is perhaps the most important failure of globalization and one of the most urgent issues that policymakers across the world are grappling with. Today's anti-globalization backlash reflects discontent with some of its costs, notably this issue of inequality, income inequality. And it's important to address it because reductions in inequality are necessary to achieve inclusion and shared prosperity, and because the very survival of globalization depends on it. In the global context, it's important to distinguish between inequality within countries and inequality between countries. And inequality within countries has risen around the world and has manifested in the advanced economies as the middle class experiencing a stagnation in wages and job insecurity. This is the case in the US as well as in parts of Europe. For example, a recent study by Brookings Institution that examined the trend in inequality in 78 countries documented that income inequality rose in 30 countries between 2000 and 2010. Meanwhile, the global elite, notably the earners in the top 1% of the income distribution, experienced substantial growth in income. Because the middle class in advanced economies is a vocal and powerful constituency, it has become a leader in this fight against globalization. The general perception is that whilst emerging markets and developing economies have benefited from globalization, middle classes in advanced economies have lost out. But it should be noted that not all emerging markets and developing economies have benefited from globalization. Some, especially in Africa, have been left behind. Whilst countries such as China and India have benefited with rapid growth and an expansion of the middle class, Africa has not benefited to the same extent. Thus, income disparity between Africa and the advanced economies has not only failed to narrow, it has actually widened. In the early 1980s, sub-Saharan Africa's income was just 12% of that of the advanced economies. Since then, it has fallen to 8%. Globalization has decimated some of the industries where Africa had a comparative advantage. Nigeria, my country, has lost 100,000 jobs in the textile industry as a result of competition and intellectual property appropriation from China. South Africa has lost more than 80,000 jobs in the manufacture of small and intermediate machinery and equipment. The loss of good manufacturing jobs is difficult for young people, and Africa is deindustrializing. Manufacturing as a share of total output is 10.5%. So despite the Sustainable Development Goals' laudable aim of achieving zero world poverty by 2030, Africa could become home to almost 90% of the world's poor, which will be over 400 million people if present trends continue. Clearly, in the debate about those left behind by globalization, far less attention has been paid to those in developing countries and emerging markets, and much more attention to the middle class in the developed countries. The inclusive realization of globalization's benefits will require an architecture that tackles both inequality within advanced countries, but that facilitates a convergence in living standards between Africa and high-income countries. The good news is that convergence is possible. The potential is there. The continent has the demographics, as Jacob noted, and the raw materials to turn its development story around with the right investment and fairer global rules and more balanced global institutions. Let me now touch on technology, an area in which Israel is a leader. Technology is shaping our ways of life, shaping our way of life in ways we've not experienced before, and at a pace that is unprecedented. The advent of the fourth industrial revolution, characterized by rapid digitization, the growing utilization of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, cloud computing, robotics, etc., has offered in a new era of disruption. In this process, modern technology is generating a lot of benefits, but also myriad challenges. And among technology's disruptive effects, the most debated one is, of course, the future of work. Some estimates suggest that with the current rate of adoption of labor-saving technology, millions of jobs are at risk of disappearing. And by some estimates, automation threatens half of all jobs globally, or up to around 2 billion jobs. Clearly, this is an important threat that we need to prepare for. The discussion around the implications of labor-saving technologies for the future of work has, however, largely focused on advanced economies and on industrial jobs, which raises the question of the relevance for emerging markets and developing countries in general, and Africa in particular. And historically, countries that faced the challenge of large-scale job creation addressed it by attracting low-wage global manufacturing jobs from advanced countries that were moving up the value ladder and outsourcing production in the face of rising labor costs. Since the Industrial Revolution in the West, Japan and several East Asian countries, and now China, have all undergone large-scale industrialization, partly because they had competitive labor costs. Now that labor costs are rising in China, labor-intensive manufacturing firms there have much higher incentives to shift production to African countries with more competitive labor costs. However, automation offers an alternative to this offshoring. As the cost of robots declines, offshoring opportunities will not only disappear, they will also make way for reshoring of production and jobs to more advanced economies. Given the demographic trends, the effect could be of great consequence for Africa. In countries where populations are aging rapidly, labor-saving technologies help cushion the effect of population aging on employment. In Africa, in contrast, the population is young and growing rapidly, so policymakers need to create millions of jobs to employ the young people entering the job market every year. So in this way, automation could be amplifying the employment challenge. But let me also mention that we need not be afraid of this disruption of technology because it also has some very good implications where Africa could leapfrog by adopting some of these technologies. So just one or two examples in the interest of time. Two I want to mention in my experience that have been very helpful and where we're urging African policymakers to think not of the fear of technology, but how we can use it to leapfrog, to lead, and to tackle the transformation challenges of the continent. One very important use that will be interesting here to people in Israel is, of course, the use of drones in health. This use of drone services is helping us overcome many infrastructure and health challenges on the continent. In Rwanda, the president approached Gavi, where I'm the chair of the board, with the problem of how do we reach people in very remote areas with health services, since there's not enough money to provide all the infrastructure that is needed in a very hilly and mountainous terrain. It threw us the challenge of trying to find a way out to reach hard-to-reach people. I'm working with a US company called Zipline and with UPS. The idea of using drones to carry blood supplies and vaccines to hard-to-reach places was what we worked on. And today in Rwanda, drones are delivering blood, medical supplies, vaccines to very remote areas. The delivery of services that used to take 4 hours, 5, and in some cases days, is now being done within 20 minutes. From a central location in Kigali, all these drones can be controlled and using GPS sent to different locations to drop their supplies. This technology is helping save thousands of lives in the country and transforming the health landscape for many poor families and poor children. Another example I'd like to cite is the e-wallet. This is in my own country. We were having so much difficulty getting fertilizer to farmers because we had a system in which the government subsidized fertilizers and middlemen and middlewomen delivered this fertilizer, and most of it disappeared in corruption. So the Minister of Agriculture, Akin Adesina, who is now the head of the African Development Bank, he was the Minister of Agriculture when I was Minister of Finance, decided to see if technology could help us solve this problem. And working with a company called Cellulant, they developed an electronic wallet system whereby farmers with mobile phones could be text an electronic voucher, which they then presented to the dealer in the village directly, collected their fertilizer and improved seeds themselves, and then the dealer traded in the voucher for the money at the bank. This system was so effective. Previously, 11% of farmers were getting access to this subsidized fertilizer. Guess what the number became with the use of this technology? 77% of farmers. And corruption was driven to the wayside. So I give these two examples. I have so many more that have occurred, you know, within my own experience. Of course, we have the famous M-Pesa, which everybody knows about, that Africa is actually a leader in fintech, in financial technology, using the mobile wallet, which is called M-Pesa in Kenya. So many people who were disempowered or did not have access to financial services now transact through mobile phones. Over 23 million Kenyans are using M-Pesa, and 74% of Kenya's GDP passes through this system. And now it's in 6 or 7 African countries and even in India. So I'm saying all this to say that technology, we could be afraid of it because of impact on jobs, but we could also embrace it because it's going to enable us leapfrog on so many problems that we have on the continent. Let me just skip quickly and make my last point. My last point is on the demographics that you mentioned, Jacob, which I think could be a boon or a bust to the world. As you said, the advanced economies are aging with low fertility rates and a rapidly aging population. In contrast, fertility rates in Africa are high. It's a very young continent. Currently, 60% of the population is under age 25. And by 2030, whereas 25% of the population in Europe and the Americas may be over age 65, 6% in Africa will be over age 65. This could be a big boon, not only for the continent, but also for the world. If the right skills and training are applied to this population, there could be a win-win for the globe. If not, it could become a nightmare. So I think what I want to end up with is that there's a challenge to us here. Policymakers on the continent are aware of it, but I also think that there are global externalities that could come from working with Africa to transform what could be a very wonderful resource. So let me end it there and leave you with these thoughts. You have a continent with great potential. The people it takes, the raw material it takes, you have emerging market countries with enormous potential. The world should reform its global systems to make this an advantage and not a source of tension. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will devote the rest of our time in 2 segments. All of them will refer to short Q&A, really ping-pong, no reasoning today. And so there will be maximum time for people to ask and raise questions. As we get ready to this, I want to have a little bit of a personal context into what you are doing in life and where did it come from. Each one of you at some stage in your life got a message that here you have been chosen to be whatever you became. And I'm not talking about the message from the parents, I'm talking from the message about you became chairman of the Fed, you became president of the Bundesbank, you became a minister of, you became many ministers. So that people know about the culture in which things happen and all the rest. Janet, who told you what and when and where were you at that point and what did you think about it? Quick.
I received a call one Sunday afternoon while I was working away at my desk. My cell phone rang and I heard voice say, "This is the White House, can you accept a call from the president?" And I felt myself kind of shaking with tension. I wasn't sure I had a serious rival for the job, and by the time this call came, I frankly had written off my chances of becoming Fed chair. And in another second, I heard Obama's voice on the phone, and he said, "Janet, I'd like you to serve as chair at the Fed. I have a lot of confidence in you and really look forward to nominating you to the job." And I was pretty much speechless. I just said, "Thank you. I really tremendously appreciate it. I will, of course, do my very best, and I appreciate the confidence that you placed in me." And that was it.
Good. Ngozi, where were you? Who called you? Take the microphone, please.
I was in my office at the World Bank where I was managing director when Jim Wolfenson, who was then president of the bank, walked into my office and said, "You have to get ready, you're going to be finance minister of your country."
What a way to fire you.
Exactly. Exactly. So I said, "Says who?" And very, very fond of Jim, very close to him. And he said, "Your president just called me and asked me if I could send you to be finance minister." And I said, "Well, how come he didn't ask me?"
Axel, take the mic, please. Somebody called you at some stage.
Yes, I got a call by the finance minister. At the time, I was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, advising him and the German Chancellor Schröder at the time on reforms. And he got on the phone, he said, "I'm calling you about the Bundesbank." They were looking for a chief economist at the time, and I thought it was about the chief economist job. He said, no, it's not about the chief economist, it's about the presidency. And I said, well, give me 5 minutes. I would have given him an immediate answer for the chief economist, but I needed to talk to my wife. That was in 5 minutes then. And I called him and I said, yes, I accept. Thank you very much.
And she regrets it up to this day. Very good. Well, stay with the microphone for a minute, because you mentioned Schröder, who in the world at least is thought of as the master of structural reforms and the one who actually created the growth for Germany. But you spent your life with Merkel. Tell us a little bit about the two of them.
Well, I was appointed under Schröder, and as we advised him, I remember the decision for what is called Hartz reforms, social reforms in Germany, was taken in a typical environment Schröder liked to take decisions on. He called the council, 5 people, to his office. We had an evening with red wine and cigars, and he had his finance minister and minister for the economy there. They strongly advised against the reforms, and then Schröder said, I'm with the experts. We have to do something. The labor market is stuck. And he later on still said, you guys gave me the right advice, but it cost me the job. Because Merkel was elected in the next election. And Merkel was a totally different style, a very rational policy maker, always same meetings in the chancellery, much more driven around consensus around the table. They invited everyone from the unions. And Merkel is still today a policy maker that takes decisions on a 51-49 basis. She looks at all the arguments in favor and all the arguments against. She weighs them and she takes a very rational decision. And unlike the previous chancellor, who very often took decisions, just on the fly, and it was but very often his political instincts were very right. And so two completely different style of people to work with, but I enjoyed working with both of them. It's been a very good time, and I wouldn't like to miss public service in my life.
Janet, we started with your story about Obama, but you had a Clinton career. Tell us a little bit.
Well, actually, I was appointed by President Clinton in 1994 to serve as a governor of the Fed for the first time. But after I'd been in that job for, just 2 years, was beginning to figure out the lay of the land, I got a call asking me to interview with him for the job of chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. And I went and served in that capacity during his the first part of his second term, and he was tremendously smart and very interested in economics, a huge amount about it, and really cared deeply about anything that touched on people and their lives. So I went to brief him usually once a week or once every other week if things were busy. If I briefed him on a financial topic, he understood it, he asked questions, but when something had to do with people and their lives, that's when he really became alive. And I will always remember one briefing that I gave him. I told him about some work that someone at the council had done about teen pregnancy and the factors that impacted teen pregnancy and how the children did who were born to teen parents. And he just dug into this topic so much that he said to me, gee, did the person do this? And he suggested a further research the person could do. This had to do with twins, and had this person looked at some other thing? And I thought to myself, gee, I wouldn't have thought about that. That's really a good question. I went back and I told my economist. He said, gee, well, that could be somebody's PhD thesis. And I said, yeah, I agree with you. And I said, but you need to do it next week. I'm going to take you back to see Clinton, and he wants to know the answer to this. And I took my economist back the next week, and he worked pretty hard during that week to follow up. But Clinton was just very knowledgeable about economics and very deeply interested in it.
Some universities give PhDs in 1 week, you can see. Ngozi, you were Minister of Finance, you were at the World Bank, but then suddenly Foreign Affairs. Is there a difference? I know one has the checkbook and the other has the promises.
Minister of Finance, nobody likes you. Your colleagues don't like you. Your boss also probably sometimes doesn't like you because you're in the business of saying no most of the time. So being Minister of Finance is no fun, but it's a lot of commitment. I think I'm the longest serving Minister of Finance in my country, 2 terms, 7 years. And that took a lot of doing. Minister of Foreign Affairs, I must say I was moved from finance to foreign affairs in my first term by President Obasanjo. And I'll just tell you a quick anecdote. We had the conflict in Côte d'Ivoire at the time. And so President Obasanjo was responsible for getting all the West African presidents to try and help make peace in ECOWAS. And so as Minister of Foreign Affairs, I was supposed to chair the foreign ministers to come up with some answers. So we met in Abidjan one time. We started at around 8:30 or 9 in the morning with all the other foreign ministers. I was chairing, and by 1 o'clock, we were still talking. And you know, my finance instincts was, we have to come to conclusion here. So I said, well, we've talked now, colleagues, can we just wrap up and make a few points. And they looked at me and said, wrap up. We just started. At that point in time, I decided I was incompetent to be Minister of Foreign Affairs. and I didn't have the temperament. I was undiplomatic, and I resigned.
As you know, in Israel, there is now a struggle about forming a government and who will be where. I can assure you, many people want to take this position.
Good luck.
Now, you were all in office during a crisis. Normally, a crisis shapes one's term. So let me go in order, and the financial crisis was a very prominent one. If you had to remember one episode, tell us a little bit about, but relatively quickly, how you felt about it, what did you do about it, how did it shape your life? And each one of them you will get the same question.
Well, I think the episode that I will always remember, as everybody else will, who lived through the crisis, was the failure of Lehman. I was president of the San Francisco Fed at the time. I took a plane to Washington.
Excuse me, for those of you who went to sleep during the decade of the previous decade, Lehman was an investment bank, Lehman Brothers, just in case. You were busy preparing gifts to Tel Aviv University. Please.
It failed on September 15th, 2008. On September 14th, the Sunday, I was traveling from San Francisco to Washington to attend a meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee, the FOMC, that would occur on September 16th, the Tuesday. And I had been watching and reading, hearing about developments over the weekend. We were very hopeful that a buyer would be found for Lehman, or if none was found, I hoped and expected that in some way a disastrously messy bankruptcy would be averted. My plane landed at Dulles, and when I turned on my cell phone, I saw that I had a message from Chairman Bernanke, and he said that I should call him right away. And I stepped out into the United Lounge, found a quiet spot, and called him, and he said, I have to tell you, it hasn't worked. It's failing. It's going to go into bankruptcy tomorrow morning. And I really can't recall having been more scared in my life than I felt at that moment. And I knew that he also was scared. We talked briefly about, I asked, didn't he think the moment had come for capital injections into the banking system? And he said he thought that would be on the agenda soon. I was simply terrified. I went into Monday morning, the next morning, Lehman did fail. The Dow dropped over 500 points that day. And I walked into a meeting on Tuesday, a Monetary Policy Committee meeting. Everybody prepares their statements, and it's all prepared, but it just seemed all, what could you say about the economic outlook? The world was just in a disastrous state, and one couldn't envision what was going to happen. It was almost a waste of time to even talk about it. And during that meeting, AIG failed, and President Geithner wasn't at the meeting when I looked around the table and I saw Geithner's not there, which is the first. I think that's the first time anyone has ever not attended an FOMC meeting. And Bernanke stepped out, adjourned the meeting several times to go take phone calls, and I thought, this is just disastrous and the world's coming to an end. And it came close, but we're glad we're
Thank you for reminding us of something I personally tried to forget, because I was actually, the only weekend I was in my New York office, I was in during that weekend, and went to see Geithner from the AIG. So exactly when he did not come, there was a reason. So let's turn now to Axel, somehow a crisis that happens on that side of the Atlantic affected everyone else, but tell us about the crisis that you remember most.
So for us, the crisis actually started earlier. I remember it was 27th July 2007, rather than 8, when a really prime lender, IKB Bank, AA bank, was facing insolvency because of an overexposure to the US subprime market, and that market was turning, not in 2008. Lehman was a late victim to that market, but we already had a lot of Bear Stearns hedge fund had problems in early 2007, and the German banking system couldn't get funding into July and August, and the ECB was the first to react to that. So we had already a round of exercises, IKB Bank, West LB, Sachsen LB, LBBW, most of the German Landesbanks were exposed to problems. And so by the time I was early morning jogging in the forest close to my house, I got a phone call by Ben Bernanke. It was a Saturday morning. He said, "Are you in the bank?" And I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "You better be in the bank." And I drove to my office. I convened the board of the bank by telephone. I was not having my driver drive me because it was too early, so I drove myself. And then we had participated because we were the supervisor of a systemic bank in the US, Deutsche Bank, with those weekend calls that Janet was there. And I remember there was subsequently a lot of meetings, and we didn't find a solution, as you said. And the bank, Lehman Bank demise blew a balance sheet hole into the Bundesbank's balance sheet of around 9 billion on that Monday morning when they went into insolvency, because the broker-dealer and the asset manager were rescued, but not Lehman Bank Europe, which was in London, and they had access to the European Central Bank discount window through the Bundesbank largely. We seized all the collateral, and then we worked it out over several years. So I tell you, I had my fair share of rescue operations. But the most interesting and I would say also a tense moment in Europe came when there was a G7 finance minister meeting in Paris. They didn't come to an agreement. Gordon Brown was pushing for a solution. Our chancellor, because we did a lot of small operations, felt that we weren't quite yet in a really difficult situation. And then she called me and said, could you bring an estimate, because the bank has to do that, of what we need if we want a systemic solution of Germany? You can come back to me. I came back 4 hours later and said, we need 500 billion as a fund. 80 billion for capital, 420 billion for guarantees. I think she dropped the phone at that point in time. And she came back a few hours later and said, we'll do it, but it's you and the finance minister that have to convince the parliament. And we did that within a record legislation, the fastest legislation ever in Germany. We passed both houses within 24 hours. And it was not a big problem to get the German social Democrats and the left party on board, because they just said, yeah, let's socialize the bank. It was much more difficult with the liberals, because we had to really change insolvency law in Germany as a result of that. So it was a tough ride, but the one thing I really liked, and I said that yesterday, is that you see that central banks can be forging common interests if individual interests by banks would not lead to the same outcome. So the role of public service and of somebody in the room that looks at the public interest rather than the individual interest of individual banks, who very often don't add up to leading to the same result, was very important to basically further the common good. And I felt that deeply in that period when all the bank CEOs, who were usually very decisive, all looked towards the central bank for guidance and for solutions. And that shows you how important it is. It was a long debate when I joined the Bundesbank. Do we still need the Bundesbank now that we have the ECB? It was never clearer than in that German banking crisis that a national central bank still has a key role to play in terms of financial crisis solution. And I thought that was a very interesting but also very tense part of my life.
Thank you. Nothing like a crisis to sharpen the mind. I want to allow time for the floor, but I want to come for a minute to you, with Ngozi, with the very same question. Was there, both of them refer to the same crisis in one way or another, the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis. you worried about the same crisis, or you worried about food crisis, things like that? Please, quick.
Well, very quickly, at the time the financial crisis hit, I was at the World Bank. And, you know, emerging markets also, because they'd had earlier crises in the late 90s, had all put in place systems. So they were not, some of them were not immediately impacted and were able to weather it for a while. But what worried me, people have forgotten that before the financial crisis, there was a food crisis. There were droughts in Australia, the major grain producing and wheat producing countries. Australia, the US had droughts and floods. And so prices of major grains and cereals went up in the world. And this impacted a lot of poor countries. So before the financial crisis, we were living a crisis in the World Bank because we had poor countries calling and saying, look, you know, the price of rice has gone up. We're going to have riots. I remember President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf from Liberia calling me on the phone and saying, you've got to do something because this is a rice-based country and the price is too high. Wheat, the same thing, many countries. So my memories of that and of the fact I was very proud that in the World Bank we put forward a crisis response window in less than no time to disburse money quickly to these countries. And then Bob Zoellick at the time asked me to go to Ukraine because Ukraine is a major exporter of wheat. And when the crisis hit, instead of countries began to hold back their own supplies because they were afraid that they would not have enough. And so Ukraine was holding back a lot of the wheat it normally exports. So he said, if I could go and talk to the government then, and it was Yulia Tymoshenko, who was then the prime minister, and I went there and I had a meeting with Yulia and explained to her what this was doing to world markets. And based on this meeting, she allowed the stocks of wheat to be released to the world market, and prices actually came down. So I'm very proud of that.
Again, I'm going to allow you asking questions, I promise you. But I don't want you to ask what will be interest rate tomorrow and all the rest. Janet's specialization and career was very much built on deep understanding of labor markets, of the unemployment rate and youth unemployment and the like. One fascinating phenomenon is that around 2007-8, the US unemployment rate was about 5%. In 2010, it became 10%. And today, it is the lowest in history. Tell them to sell. But when we look at Europe, unemployment rate, which was equal to the one in the US at around 2010, has not declined to such an extent. And again, there is a big gap. What is it in the US that caused unemployment rate or enabled unemployment rate to decline so rapidly? And I'm going to ask Axel, what is it in Europe that prevented unemployment rate to decline? And then we'll open to the floor. Please.
Well, I think the normal rate of unemployment in the United States that's consistent with stable inflation has really declined a great deal. In the United States, it used to be thought to be over 6%, and it's now estimated to be closer to 4%. We have an older, more stable labor market, and there's less turnover in the labor market. I think workers have less bargaining power than they used to decades ago, and job security has declined a good deal in the United States. I think workers are bargain much less aggressively than they used to. Firms seem to have figured out a lot of ways through globalization and technology to be less subject to unions and bargaining power by workers. So I think that's one thing. But also, we have hidden forms of lack of participation in the labor market that doesn't show up in the actual unemployment pool. We've seen a major decline in the number of people, of prime-age people in the United States who are looking for work. And this is not just something that occurred since the financial crisis. It's something that occurred over decades as job opportunities, good jobs with decent wages, with benefits, have gradually disappeared due to technological change and globalization. Male labor force participation has been declining for decades. It plummeted during the financial crisis and has moved up, but it's not even back to levels that we saw prior to the financial crisis. And, you know, this decline of prime-age people not working, not looking for work, being alienated from the labor market is really associated with a great deal of distress in the United States. The opioid epidemic, and you know, distress in which people feel alienated from the labor market.
Thank you. I'm not going to move for a minute. We'll freeze the European perspective. I want to see if there are some hands in the crowd. And okay, now we are going to be strict, real ping pong. Question, answers, statements later on. So we'll start from right to left through the center. Please, can you stand up? Sure. But I'm going to be very ruthless. We need microphones.
I have two questions.
No way. No, only one. Choose the one.
They're one words.
Okay.
To Mr. Brexit and to Ms. Yellen. To Ms. Yellen, why is the Fed so timid in selling its debt?
Thank you very much. We are going to accumulate questions so the speakers will choose which one to avoid. Please write them down. We go from right to left. Leo Lederman, please.
Thanks, Jacob. I think the number one topic in the last few days and the Financial Times everywhere is the evolving trade war between the US and China. There are many companies, technology companies in Israel that have very good relations with China, very good relations with the US. And the strategic question now is, how do you plan your business strategy when these two guys are in something that could escalate into a full trade war? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I like the model that was stated here, the Canadian model. One word for a question, please.
Your view, minimum wage on improving inequality, but also improving inflation.
Thank you very much. Can you pass it to him, please?
For Dr. Ngozi, please. Your thoughts on African routes out toward avoiding middle class stalling with the reshoring and the technology shifts in the advanced countries.
Thank you very much. Move the microphone to this side, please. A row ahead. Yes. One front. Right. Thank you.
A question for Dr. Yellen. If you see a possible in the next downturn that will be in the U.S. Negative interest rate.
Can you put it to the back? And in the same row you will move. Please.
Global food insecurity.
Thank you. Move on.
To Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, could you elaborate about the African attempts to make a free trade area?
Thank you. Can you move it? Can you take this, please?
Yes, sir. We're talking about blockchain and all this cryptocurrency. How do you see it working with the global economics? And
thank you very much. Please.
My question was about the role of blockchain in the future.
Very good. Thank you very much. Yes.
The question is about Israel. Where do you place Israel? Like America, like Europe, or like emerging market?
Going to the moon. Next. Please.
There is talk about the reintroduction of the Glass-Steagall Act, the Banking Act. I'd just like to have your opinion on it.
Thank you very much, and don't forget to explain the Glass-Steagall Act. Anyone else? Very good. Last row, please, and then this will wrap it up.
How come doesn't Europe doesn't have a competition for JP Morgan Chase, a banking champion?
I've just invited our speakers to come again next year in order to complete the discussion. But as a prelude for next year, we'll give them the hors d'oeuvres for a very quick, you choose which ones, you have 2 minutes, each one go. Move.
Okay. First question, why the Fed so timid in selling assets? The Fed is gradually running down its balance sheet, not through sales, but through diminishing reinvestment of principal. There's no particularly good reason why it should run down its assets. There's no compelling reason for it to do it. And it's adopting a new framework for operating monetary policy that calls for a much larger balance sheet. Second, the minimum wage and inequality and inflation. I think there's a very good rationale for increasing the minimum wage at the national level. It's been a long time since that's happened. It's now so low in real terms, I doubt that it would have very much adverse impact on employment. I think a better way or a complementary way to deal with inequality is the earned income tax credit. On inflation, changing the minimum wage would have very minimal impact on inflation, and any impact it did have would be a one-time only impact on the price level. Finally, let me take Glass-Steagall briefly. There is some discussion, particularly Senator Warren, of reinstating Glass-Steagall. My personal view is that Glass-Steagall was not responsible for the crisis, and it wouldn't be an improvement, in my view, to reinstate it. The banks that failed were investment banks that Lehman, Bear Stearns, that were not supervised by any regulator at the time of the financial crisis, and they were outside of bank holding companies. Now all the major investment banks are part of bank holding companies and subject to pretty rigorous Fed supervision. Reinstating Glass-Steagall would just diminish the supervision of major investment banks, and that wouldn't be good.
Thank you very much. No way to misunderstand the messages. Please, Ngozi, same pace.
Okay, very quickly, the first question on avoiding stagnation for the African middle class. I think we should focus on industries without smokestacks. The creative industries, horticulture, agri-tech, and I think this is where Israel could really play a role because you're leaders in this. So I'm just throwing up a challenge to you, including this university, to make links with the African countries because I think the exchange and transfer of technology could be very important. Secondly, African attempts at a free trade area, very important. 22 countries have now ratified, so it should go into effect. It will create a large market of 1.2 billion consumers, and this will enable investment to be attracted because people can now trade across borders much more freely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Axel. By the way, I see some people are coming down. The buffet organizers got the instruction not to open the buffet until you arrive. So please, no reason to rush. Go.
On Brexit, I think it is one of the key European issues. We talked about uncertainty. Brexit keeps emanating uncertainty into the European economy. It will not dissipate anytime soon. I am one of the few Europeans from the continent who has a certain degree of understanding for the British frustration with European decision-making, largely because Europe is actually made up of two entities. One is the Eurozone. Most European members are members of that, and what has happened over the last decade is the governance of the European environment, of the Eurozone, was driven forward in a very forceful way. There was much less focus on the EU agenda outside the Eurozone, and actually moving from unanimity to double majority voting, which means 2/3 of GDP and 2/3 of people voting in favor, left some decisions for the UK to not be able to influence them, but actually turning against their key interests, like the reorganization of financial market regulation, etc. So I think there is a sense of frustration that whilst we're part of it, we cannot decisively influence the fate, and that probably led to some frustration on on the side of UK policymakers about the direction of travel. What I'm worried about is, you know, along your life you may decide to go separate ways, but this has to happen in an orderly and amicable way. I find the current frustration around the negotiation process, and actually the fact that UK cannot be better off in any dimension leaving, that is not, in my view, the way you treat a former member of the club. If a former member of the club leaves, you make him an honorary member of the club, you preserve some rights, and you move on in the best interest of both parties. To make former membership a sort of very bad environment and to turn against the UK, in my view, is the wrong political direction. It is actually not furthering the European integration course. A friendly UK on the sidelines is much better than an unfriendly UK that is disengaged with Europe. And so I find European policymakers are really missing the story of post-war unification. It's a remote memory by now, but it's still relevant. We need a united Europe, and if we all don't have the same future political vision, well, we should coexist, but we should not turn against each other. So. Trade wars, there is an African saying that says, if the elephants fight, the grass gets hurt. We're the grass. In terms of global banks, for me, the strategy, if there is confrontation between the US and China, we're onshore US, we're onshore China, we're trying to get in between. Part of our bank is a Chinese onshore bank, part of our bank, big part, 20,000 people of 60,000 is a US bank. We're serving communities everywhere we are present, and we work in the interest of those communities. So I see no whatsoever conflict in serving American clients, serving Chinese clients, and basically doing the best for both constituencies and not getting drawn into politics. Banking is not about politics, it's about serving clients.
Thank you. Let me make quick 3 last remarks, and you will make it on to lunch on time. Number one, you mentioned the African saying about the trade. So actually I heard it at the original time when it was stated. It was in 1988 in the Development Committee of the World Bank, IMF, and the minister from one of the African countries told the audience about the fact that being a developing country, it always suffers when there is skirmish. And he spoke about the elephants, and the statement about the elephants was, when elephants fight, the grass suffers. When elephants make love, the grass suffers. Too bad for the grass. I do not know to tell it in Swahili, but this was the original one, and probably Ngozi will know. Second remark about Brexit. The discussion already highlighted it. What is fascinating is that it was raised only as a footnote to the end of the discussion. Those of you who come from the UK know that there is no way to turn to the daily newspaper or the politics of it without looking at it, which means that distance put the right perspective. As Tony Blair once said about this referendum that started it all, which is the problem of a political suicide is that you live to regret it. Finally, a self-serving remark. We have here central bankers, and they always said, as a former central banker, etc. I have two things to tell you. First, as a former, the only title nobody will take away from you is the former. But more profoundly, once a central banker, always a central banker, and that's a very self-serving remark, of course. So we are now at 12:59, and I was told to bring you to soft landing towards 1 o'clock. I want to thank you all. It was great, and please express appreciation to our extraordinary panel.